British cartoonist and comic artist Tom Browne was born in Nottingham in 1870, and in his teens he was apprenticed to a lithographic printer. He subsequently enrolled at Nottingham School of Art, and while still studying, he also sold some humorous drawings to a couple of London newspapers and comics. With the money he'd been paid to date, he set off for London in the hope of developing the publishing contacts he'd already made and finding more. He didn't find the going easy in the capital, but gradually he got more regular work. Then in 1896, what would soon become his most famous and enduring creation appeared for the first time in the illustrated Chips comic. He'd created two down-and-outs who were originally named Weary Waddles and Tired Timmy, and they made a strong impression on the editor, who immediately made them regulars in the comic's pages. Soon their names were resolved as Weary Willie and Tired Tim, and they became immensely popular and quickly became a virtual national institution. By 1897 he had made enough money to establish his own lithographic colour printing firm in Nottingham, which proved to be successful and generated yet more income. By the turn of the century he was not only turning out 6 full-page strips a week, but he also managed to produce more illustrations for magazines, including Punch and The Tatler. In 1904, Tom Browne's Comic Annual was published, and among other strips it featured a comic update on the story of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, who had served as the original inspiration for Tim and Willie. In 1908 he was commissioned to create a mascot for Johnny Walker Whiskey, and although others would reinvent the character in later years, the Striding Man mascot was his original creation. The pen and ink technique he used in all his comic work would come to be influential on others who followed. His own experience in printing gave him a clear understanding of the inherent problems of printing on poor quality newsprint. So he kept his line work simple, with bold calligraphic pen strokes and solid spot blacks to punctuate the white areas. Browne did create other strips, such as the remarkably similar Airy Alf and Bouncing Billy, which first appeared in the big budget around 1900. And there was even a spin-off series featuring junior versions of Tim and Willie. Other than his comics, he was immensely successful as a creator of comic postcards, and in this arena Browne's work was reproduced in colour. I may well be wrong, but it looks like these were coloured at printing. They look far too solid and flat to be watercolour, but the crude dot screening used in the print process really makes it impossible to tell. But however poorly printed, the public loved them, and they were enthusiastically sent back and forth between family members and friends. But Browne was unfortunately yet another from this period who would burn brightly but only briefly, and he died following surgery to treat his cancer at the age of 39 in 1910. Even though their creator was gone, Willie and Tim continued to be drawn by other artists, and they kept going until 1953. Karl Alexander Wilke is another example of an undeniably significant illustrator about whom very little is recorded. The pitiful amount I could find had to be auto-translated from the German by Google, and of course the result was risible, but I've done my best with what there was. He was born in Leipzig in eastern Germany in 1879, and he studied at the Art Academy there from 1898 to 1902. In 1903 he relocated to Vienna and began work as an illustrator, mostly for magazines, including appearances in the highly influential Jugend. In 1905 he started getting commissions from the newly launched satirical magazine Die Musketer, and this would go on to be by far his strongest and most enduring professional relationship. So much so that virtually all the images I've used here are from Die Musketer's pages and covers. I have no proof, but the volume of work he created for the magazine suggests that he worked as a staff artist rather than a freelancer. His images were invariably dark and compelling, and although the meaning of many he created is lost to history, they nevertheless exert an enduring hold on the viewer. Austria was allied with Germany in the First World War, and during the war years Wilke produced many illustrations on that theme. But rather than attacking the enemy, these images concentrated on the misery endured by the troops and the grim presence of death himself overseeing events. Wilke was also a moderately successful painter, and I did find a handful of other graphic work he created, including a series of patriotic historical postcards for the Austrian Federal Publishing Organisation. But none of it was the equal of his Die Musketer illustrations. It's yet more speculation on my part, but it seems likely that the bulk of his magazine illustration was created as monochrome, directly onto lithographic stone with brush and crayon, and the colour added in subsequent print runs. It's certain that many of his contemporaries favoured this method, and on many of his images there is telltale texturing, which would be actually harder to achieve on paper. But however they were created, his illustrations were never less than compelling, and his creative use of limited colour was easily among the best of its kind. Die Musketer continued to be published up to 1940, and Wilke's work was published until its final collapse. But from the early 30s onward, the magazine had begun reusing previously published material, including many of Wilke's illustrations, to keep costs down. And it's around this time that the trail runs out, and the only other solid information I have is that at the age of 75, Karl Alexander Wilke died in Vienna in 1954. It's true to say Rolf Armstrong was one of America's earliest and greatest pin-up artists, but that wasn't the full extent of his output, even if attractive females were almost his exclusive subject. He was born John Scott Armstrong in Michigan in 1889 into a prosperous family. When, how and why he took the name Rolf isn't recorded. Within a few years of his birth, the family business failed, and in 1899 they moved to Detroit. His father died in 1903, and a year later he and his mother moved to Seattle. By now his artistic interests were emerging as more than a hobby, and he moved to Chicago in 1908, where he studied at the Art Institute. By 1913 he was doing well enough to be commissioned for a series of covers for Puck magazine, and the portraits of female faces he created established his reputation. After a trip to Paris in 1919 for some intensive study at the Académie Julian, he returned to New York and picked up where he'd left off, but with suitably enhanced artistic skills. It was magazines, and particularly movie fan magazines such as Photoplay, which would become and remain his most frequent source of commissions. The atmospheric, dramatically lit pastel renders of leading female stars of the period, such as Mary Pickford and Greta Garbo, fed a massive public appetite for all things Hollywood. The equation was simple: publish an Armstrong illustration of a movie siren and watch your circulation rise. In the 1920s, sheet music of the popular songs of the day sold in large numbers, and Armstrong created many bright romantic covers featuring yet more women's faces. And as the 30s became the 40s, it was pin-ups which now dominated his output, many of which were for the leading calendar publishers Browne and Bigelow. And Armstrong's mildly suggestive images of carefree girls were extremely popular. He only infrequently created nudes, or at least almost nude images, and most of his pin-up work was actually quite demure and only mildly erotic. In 1940, a young woman by the name of Jewel Flowers started modelling for Armstrong. Their professional collaboration and friendship lasted for 2 decades. The first painting he created of her, titled How Am I Doing, was first published in Browne and Bigelow's best-selling calendar for 1942, and it became one of Armstrong's most reproduced pictures. In total, he created around 50 to 60 images with her as the model, and these cheerful pastel illustrations of female beauty became the most admired of his career. Armstrong died in 1960 in Hawaii at 71 years old, and I don't know about you, but I find it quite heartwarming that he left a large part of his wealth to Ms. Flowers for her contribution to his great success. Like a handful of others I've featured before in the series, George Giusti was as much a graphic designer as he was an illustrator, and apparently a successful architect and sculptor too. And such is the level of abstraction and absence of conventional drawing in his images that I suspect there'll be some of the more realistically inclined viewers who don't think he was an illustrator at all. He was born in Milan in Italy in 1908 to a Swiss father and Italian mother, and he later went on to study at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Milan. After graduation, he worked as a designer in Lugano, Italy, and then moved to Zurich, Switzerland, where he opened his own design studio in 1930. Although he was successful in Zurich, by 1938 he was ready for a new challenge, and he decided to emigrate to America. And in New York he established a new studio and quickly built up an impressive corporate client base. He'd been working for only a couple of years when America entered World War II, and although he didn't produce any actual propaganda, he did produce a lot of advertising work for clients who were industrially linked to the war effort. And these images revealed the influence of French poster artist A.M. Cassandra, who was coincidentally also working in America at the time. In 1941, Giusti created the first in a series of radical semi-abstracted dynamic compositions for the covers of the business magazine Fortune. These images were like nothing else seen in commercial illustration at the time, and the graphic power of his industrially themed subjects revealed an unerring aesthetic sensibility that few could match. In terms of his use of materials and their application in what was the more illustrative side of his output, Giusti worked almost exclusively in tempera paint. Usually he applied the base colour with a brush, as you would expect, before selectively applying ink, sprayed with an airbrush for smooth, or almost as often roughly textured tonal gradation. But that was by no means his only approach, and there are also quite a few examples of his work using more expressionistic colour application. He also incorporated collage techniques and even included selective photography into his compositions. From the 1940s onwards, he was also a popular choice for book cover design, and although these employed the techniques I've described and others I haven't, they were all expressions of Giusti's modernist aesthetic. Similarly, the work he created for his corporate clients was equally compelling, and it balanced formal composition with more visually playful elements. Throughout the 1950s to the end of his career, he continued to create highly imaginative illustrative design, and in addition to his book, magazine and corporate work, he also produced some sharp modernist record covers. In the late 50s and 1960s, he produced another long series of striking covers for Holiday magazine. These imaginative pictures used collage and photographic elements, combined with paint and ink, in a series of compositions evoking aspects of traditional national culture. In the early 1970s, he retired from commercial work to pursue his career as a 3D artist. But for me and others who are aware of him, it's the graphic image making which is his greatest legacy. Giusti died in Connecticut in 1990 at the age of 82. And you might be interested in checking out the equally distinctive work of his son, Robert Giusti. That's all for now, and I hope I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.